Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. All that we're running from seems to stay right behind us, while all that God is leading us to seems to be getting further and further away. As the miles pass, it's easy to feel alone. It's easy to feel lost. And yet, if we know what to look for, the reminders of God's faithfulness are all around us, shaping us, molding us, preparing us for what's ahead. Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. The road can be hard. The road can seem to stretch forever. There will be moments of frustration, moments of doubt, moments when you want to quit. But as we learn to trust God and follow where He leads, we may just find that some of our best growth happens in the wilderness.
You know, there are days when you just have to recognize you don't really feel like yourself. There's lots of things that cause it. Sometimes it's because you're a little under the weather. Maybe you're a little overtired. You're stressed out. Something just feels off, right? We all have days like that. Sometimes it's as simple as a bad case of the Mondays, right? It just seems like something's off. You're not sure what it is. And oftentimes what we find, or at least what I have found, is that in those days, a good night's sleep, maybe some physical activity, a little sunshine, will do a world of difference. And if the Snickers commercials are to be believed, all you need is a mediocre candy bar to suddenly feel like yourself again. But there are moments, I think, that are more significant than what we would call just a case of the Mondays or being tired or just feeling a little bit off. There are moments of significant and lasting change in life, right? Where it's not simply just a matter of you don't feel like yourself. There are these moments where you're not even sure who you are to begin with. And they leave you feeling a bit in a tizzy. Now, the proper term for that sort of experience is called an identity crisis. And psychologists will suggest to us that we all go through a number of those sorts of experiences as a natural part of the aging experience. Right? There are times in our lives, there are these seasons that we enter into where everything is changing. We are in a time of transition, particularly as we make our way through adolescence and toward adulthood. There are these natural transitions that are classified as an identity crisis because we're forging our own identity. Right? We're forging an identity that exists apart from, but usually really interconnected to, our family of origin. But as we begin to figure out who we are, we're making big decisions, we're exploring different career paths, we're trying to figure out what we want to do when we grow up, right? We're trying to test the waters maybe with some romantic relationships, we're finding our tribe of people. That group of friends that you're just going to do life with for the next few years as you all kind of grow together. It's the time in life when you're forging your personality, you're figuring out your own personal style. It's why there are these chunks of years that are really awkward for everyone because nobody knows who they are yet. They're just kind of figuring it out. And these natural turning points in life kind of shape our sense of self. They shape our sense, our understanding of who we are. But beyond those expected moments of transition, the things that we would say, those are just naturally a part of growing up, of getting older. They're what we expect these moments to come in life. There are moments that are very formative for our identity. And there are moments with the potential for unexpected and uninvited changes, sometimes traumatic experiences that send our sense of self, our understanding of our identity, who we are, what we're supposed to be doing. It sends all of those things into a spiral. And we find life feels like it's spinning out of control. Sometimes it's a career change. Maybe it's the loss of a job, the death of someone close to you, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a child, a dear friend. Maybe it's something like a debilitating illness or injury that suddenly changes what your day-to-day life looks like. Sometimes it's the kind of thing that comes with life stage changes. Suddenly you find yourself on the cusp of becoming an empty nester, or you find retirement looming, and you know everything's about to change. There are lots of these moments in life that can challenge and alter how we see ourselves. Not only how we see ourselves in relationship to the world around us, but how we see ourselves even in relationship to ourselves. And we can suddenly feel like the firm ground beneath our feet has begun to fall away. Everything's in free fall, and we're just not sure what to make of it all. And so, as we continue to explore the ways and words of Jesus, these are the kind of moments that become the perfect sort of example of times that leave you feeling as if you are in the wilderness. You aren't where you were. You aren't necessarily where you're going to be. You're not even sure exactly where you're headed. You just know everything's different. And you aren't sure who you are anymore in this new moment. As we began this conversation about the wilderness last week, we started exploring the life of a man named Moses. We introduced us to Moses and how he was born the child of Hebrew slaves. And how he was rescued by his parents' refusal to throw him into the Nile River when Pharaoh said all male Hebrew children should be killed as a means of population control. The fear was the slave population might rise up and overpower Egypt. And so Pharaoh makes this deathly mandate. And we saw the way that Moses is spared from death, but that ironically his parents ultimately do cast him into the Nile. But first they fashion a waterproof basket to set him afloat. Ironically, the Old Testament calls it literally an ark. It uses the same language to describe the boat that Noah built for his wild little adventure in the water. That's a story for another time, though. And so Moses is set adrift on the water, where he's soon discovered, adopted, and then raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He grows up a son of the Egyptian court. And all is well until one day he sees an Egyptian mistreating some of his fellow Hebrews, and he murders the Egyptian, tries to cover up his crime. But when it becomes clear that Pharaoh knows about his actions, Moses flees into exile. He makes his way to the land of Midian, and while he's there, he meets and marries the daughter of Jethro, a Midianite priest. And as we met Moses last week, he had transitioned in his life to tending his father-in-law's sheep on the backside of the desert. And it was there, all alone, that Moses began to experience, no doubt, the sort of trauma that makes the perfect breeding ground for an identity crisis. And we saw last week as we began this conversation that time in the wilderness is this sort of in-between time, right? We aren't where we were, we're not where we're going, we're not sure what's happening. It's this in-between time. And sometimes we aren't even sure if there is a place for us to go, much less not knowing where we're headed. And we begin to get a sense why the wilderness can seem like such a daunting season. Because everything we thought we knew about who we are, everything we thought we knew about what we were supposed to be doing in this world has changed in an instant. And we find ourselves feeling a bit lost, feeling a bit alone, feeling a bit aimless in the wilderness. Now, my hope for us in this conversation is that we can look into the past experience of God's people, Israel, in their season in the wilderness. And from their experience, we can begin to see some principles about who God is and what God is like, that we can then take those principles and use them to help us navigate our own seasons when we find ourselves in the wilderness. So for some of you, that may be exactly where you find yourself. You're going, this is really timely because I feel lost and aimless and in the wilderness. For others of you, you're like, I'm doing pretty okay. Tuck this away. Life has a way of dropping us into the middle of the wilderness when we least expect it. And so my hope is that we'll find some principles about God's character, who He is, that will help us navigate our own seasons when we're kind of wandering in the wilderness. And so to get us started today, to kind of move the conversation forward a bit, I want to introduce us to a big idea. And if you want to jot some things down, if you follow along in YouVersion on your phone or a tablet, you can find some things there and take some notes. All this on the screen will be there for you, there in the teaching notes. It goes like this. As in-between time, the wilderness can blur the lines of your identity. Okay, that's where we want to begin today, with this recognition that as in-between time, the wilderness can often blur the lines of our identity. Our understanding of who we are, what we're supposed to be doing, where we're supposed to be going. The wilderness has this way of blurring the lines of our identity. To get us going today, to help us show what I'm talking about, I invite us to turn back to Exodus chapter 3. Again, this will be in YouVersion in the Bible app. Just go to the Events tab. You can find everything there. But we're going to go back into the text we looked at last week in Exodus chapter 3. So Moses is in Midian. He's on the backside of the desert, pasturing his father-in-law's sheep, when he sees a bush on fire that will not burn up. And so Moses in this moment does what you and I would do. He's like, I'm going to go check this out because it's not normal for a bush to be on fire but not burn up. And Moses goes to investigate. Let's pick it up in verse 4 of Exodus chapter 3. Now when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Remember, we saw last week that God shows up and often has this way of turning even the wilderness into holy ground where suddenly everything begins to change. Let's press this forward a bit. Verse number 6. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now that's where we left things last week. Let's press forward, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So there is this incredible and miraculous moment. There is a bush that is on fire that will not burn up, and when Moses goes to investigate, he is called and commissioned by God to go and deliver his people from Egypt. Like this is huge, right? Like this is the kind of moment that changes everything. And Moses' response is less than ideal. Right? Moses says, who am I that I should go to Egypt and deliver your people? Now, we might want to give Moses the benefit of the doubt, right? It might be that he's not sure if this is legitimate, right? I mean, you can't just go taking the word of every talking bush you meet in the desert, am I right? So we have to allow, let's give Moses a little benefit of the doubt. Like maybe he's just not sure if this is true. But the problem with that is that if we look at verse 6, when God introduces himself, the text tells us that Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Okay, so it sounds like Moses is pretty convinced that this is a legitimate divine encounter. And yet, his response is, who am I? Now the text specifically emphasizes the I. He's saying, who do you think I am? Me? Who, me? Who am I that I should go and deliver your people? Now, maybe this is humility, right? Maybe it's the last time I was in Egypt, I killed a guy and Pharaoh wants me dead thing. Makes sense, that would track. Maybe it's the fact that 40 years have gone by since he last was in Egypt. And that in that time, the Moses that grew up in the palace, expecting to be somebody, found himself tending his father-in-law's sheep on the backside of the desert as a nobody. Talk about an identity crisis, right? Moses seems to have gone from the kind of guy when he was in Egypt who would say things like, do you know who I am? Which if you have to ask, it means they don't know. And if they do know, they don't care. But Moses seems to have gone from being the guy that puffs out his chest and is like, do you know who I am? To being the guy who says, who do you think I am that I should go? Everything about his understanding of who he is has shifted and changed. See, because in the wilderness, it's an in-between time. And so the wilderness has this way of blurring the lines of our identity. Who we thought we knew we were, suddenly we're not so sure anymore. What we knew we were supposed to be doing, all of a sudden it doesn't quite track the way we thought it would. And it's in God's response that we begin to get some vital perspective that will help us when we find ourselves in these moments in the wilderness. Because God doesn't answer Moses' question. Did you catch that? God tells Moses, "You go deliver my people, I'm sending you." And Moses' response is, "Who, me? Who do you think I am that I should go?" And God never answers that question. God never responds to the question that Moses asked with an answer. Because in this moment, this isn't about Moses' identity. This is about God's identity. And so he doesn't answer the question that Moses asks. He says, "I will be with you. And you know that I am sending you." So Moses says, "Who am I?" Emphatically asking, "Me?" And God says, No, I am sending you. It's me. I'm the one who's sending you, and I will be with you. It's as if God is saying, "Moses, it doesn't really matter who you are in this moment, because I'm the one who is sending you." Here's the thing about that, though. That only matters if the one who is sending him has authority that matters. And so who is sending him? God has already told us. If we look back to around verse 6, he says, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." If we continue and press on, he says, "I am the one who has heard the cries of my people Israel, and I am the one who is concerned about their suffering." I am the one who has come down to rescue them, to bring them out from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God says, "I'm the God of your forefathers. I'm the God of the promises of the covenant. I'm the one you've heard all the stories about." And God seems to move from the past to the present to the future of the experience of His people. "I have heard the cries of my people, and I am concerned about them, and I'm going to deliver them." See, the wilderness has a way of twisting up our understanding of who we are, chipping away at, blurring the lines of our identity, just like it did for Moses. And so when that happens, know this: when life in the wilderness brings your identity into question, God's actions bring His identity into focus. The wilderness will twist you up. It will blur the lines of your identity. And so when life in the wilderness brings your identity into question, you're saying, "Who am I? I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing." When life in the wilderness brings your identity into question, God's actions will bring His identity into focus. And remember, what does He tell Moses? Your identity is not what matters right now in this moment. Mine is. I'm the one who is sending you. No matter the season we find ourselves in, God's identity matters far more for our circumstances than ours does. In the wilderness, it will beat you up. It will take away all that you know to be true of yourself. But here's what the wilderness can't do. The wilderness can't touch the identity of God. Cannot change a thing about who He is or what He is like. And the best news of all is that He promises to be with us. He says, "Moses, I'm sending you, and I will be with you. Now, throughout the Old Testament, this concept, this idea of God being with someone, being with His people, is a marker of His blessing. It is a marker of His faithfulness to them. The theme stretches across the Old Testament. What are the last words that Jesus says to His disciples before He returns to the Father in heaven? Go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, behold, check this out, y'all. I will be with you always. The wilderness cannot touch the identity of God. And in the person of Jesus, He has promised that He will be with us. So when life in the wilderness brings your identity into question, let God's actions bring His identity into focus. So who is this God? He's the one who hears the cries of His people. He is the one who is concerned about their suffering. One of the biggest lies that a wilderness season will tell you is that nobody cares, that you are on your own, that if you can't figure it out, I guess you're just toast. But in the wilderness season, God meets Moses and He says, I have heard the cries of my people. I am concerned about their suffering. And I have come down to rescue them. The incredible thing about this moment is that this becomes what God hangs His identity on for all time with His people. If we fast forward in the story a bit, when Moses brings the people to Mount Sinai and God is giving them the law, the Old Testament Torah, the preamble to what we know as the Ten Commandments goes like this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. God decides this moment, coming down, hearing the cries of His people, being concerned about their suffering, and coming down to rescue them, is the thing that He is going to allow to identify who He is for generations. But the wilderness wants to convince us that it's about our identity, when really we got to figure out it's about who God is. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the God who rescues, the God who saves. So when life in the wilderness brings your identity into question, let God's actions bring His identity into focus. Here's the hard part, though, about making this shift in the wilderness. You see, oftentimes, if we're going to see God do what God has promised to do, we're going to have to do what God has commanded us to do. Can I give that to you again? Because that's a whole lot to digest. Oftentimes, in these moments where we find ourselves in the wilderness, leaning on the rescuing power of God, if we're going to see God do what God has promised to do, we're going to have to do what God has commanded us to do. Let's go back to Exodus 3 here. Let's look at God's response to Moses. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go and bring your people out of Egypt?" And God says, "I will be with you. And this will be a sign that I'm the one who sent you. After you lead my people out of Egypt, you'll worship on this mountain." Let's make sure we've got our heads around this. Moses is in this moment of crisis like, "Who am I? I'm not the guy you want, Lord." And God says, no, but I'm going to be with you. And this is how you're going to know that I'm the one who's sending you today. After you bring the people out, you'll worship God on this mountain. Do you see the conundrum here? The hard part of the wilderness is often that we have to obey before we know how it's going to go. God says, go, do this, and once you've done it, you'll know you were sent by me. Sometimes we got to obey before we know how it's going to go. And we start to understand what Moses is experiencing in this moment. Because the wilderness, there in the notes if you want to jot it down, the wilderness allows us to reshape our identity in obedience to God's calling. Right? The wilderness twists us up, blurs the lines of our identity. We're not sure who we are. But it presents us with these opportunities to reshape our identity in our obedience to God's calling. I've shared with you guys in another time, in another context, about the journey that brought our family here to South Carolina, and the way that there were some difficult days. We were coming off the heels of 2 failed attempts to revitalize local churches. And we were still sorting through the fallout of the most recent one of those. And it was an experience that left us feeling very wounded by the structure of the church. If you don't know the story, you want more, ask me about it, and I'm happy to share a little bit more of how God was at work in those moments. But suffice it to say for now, it was a season for me, for our family, that we were deep in the wilderness. Talk about a crisis of identity, not being sure who you are, or what you're supposed to be doing, or if there's even anywhere to go. I felt that deeply in my soul. And in the midst of this, it's all unfolding around us at the same time. And in the midst of that, we begin this conversation with some folks who want us to explore whether God might be calling us to a little place in upstate South Carolina. And for the sake of our kids, for the sake of my calling, and I'll go so far as and be transparent enough to say, for the sake of my faith, I had to know that I knew it was right. We were deep in the wilderness. And in all of our conversations with the district revitalization team, with the local leadership team here, Jessica and I had a sense of peace. But there was no home run, without a doubt, burning bush kind of moment. Right? Like, that would have come in really handy on a few days. But it never came. So we came down for a visit. And as we were driving back from South Carolina to Missouri, which if you don't know how long that is, just assume it's a long drive. And because we were on the road, we started to do what we often do when we're traveling, because we have 5 kids and you can only watch Frozen so many times. We started playing the license plate game, right? Just where you spot the different plates along the way, and you're like, oh, you mark them off the list. Well, we routed through Atlanta, and so that was a big help. If you ever need help, like finishing up the license plate lane, just go through a major city. You'll see stuff you never thought you'd see, including Hawaii, which was odd, right? Okay, so we're just like, oh, that's like an all-timer. How often do you see a car from Hawaii? So we check it off the list, right? So we're going along, and somewhere about Illinois, As the kids have all nodded off to sleep, Jessica and I are continuing to kind of play the license plate game as we're talking, just trying to discern what God is doing. And somewhere around Illinois, we realized, hey, like, we're getting really close. Like, we got most of these things checked off. And so jokingly, in the dark somewhere in Illinois, we're like, well, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the sign. Right? If we hit all 50 before we get home, maybe that's the clearest sign we could have that God is in us. And we were kind of just, being silly and playing with it. But it seemed less and less silly the more states that got checked off the list. Right? All of a sudden when you hit like 42, you're going, wait a minute. Okay, we've been praying for a sign. Maybe this is it. And it seemed less and less silly until we pulled into our driveway in Missouri, one state shy of 50. And I thought, well, I didn't really think that was going to be a sign anyway. So we spent the next several days continuing to pray and discern, Lord, what are you doing? Is this right? In fact, a few days after we got back, I was getting off the interstate, and I looked up, and there was a semi-trailer in front of me that had the one plate we needed, South Dakota. And so I texted Jessica a picture really quick, and I was like, what's the statute of limitations for a divine sign, right? And we just kind of had a good laugh about it, and we just knew, okay, we're going to have to figure out whether God is in this move. And so clearly, as you can tell, we said yes. We loaded up the Beverly Hillbillies clan and made our way halfway across the country to Lyman. And as we brought the first load of our stuff from Missouri to here, Jessica and I are moving stuff into the parsonage next door as we were kind of knew we were going to be stopping there as we figured out kind of a long-term place to live. And the leadership team was there. They're helping us unpack. And in the midst of the pastoral transition, some folks have been cleaning out the basement at the parsonage because, like 20 years of church storage had just kind of piled up. It just happened. Like, don't open doors around here, right? It's not a good thing. Stuff just seems to kind of pile up. And so folks have been kind of clearing out the basement. So as we finish unloading the truck, they're like, hey, you want to come see the progress we've made in the basement? I'm like, sure. And so as we make our way through the basement, we're just walking around, and lo and behold, in the empty basement of the house next door in Lyman, South Carolina, I look over, and hanging on the wall is this South Dakota license plate that expired in 2004. Much to my surprise, and as we would find out later, to everyone who had ever been in that house, there was a South Dakota license plate hanging in the basement. This now has a place on a shelf in my office with a whole bunch of little trinkets that tell the story of our family's ministry journey. Sometimes in the wilderness, you got to do what God says before you know how it's going to go. And the wilderness has this ability to reshape our identity in our obedience to God's calling. And guys, I shared that story with you for one reason, really. Because I know what it is to be in the wilderness and for the wilderness to blur the lines of your identity, where you just don't know who you are. You're not sure where to go or if there's even a place for you to go. But I've also seen the wilderness be a place to reshape our identity and our calling as God reveals who He is in His actions to save and rescue and redeem us. Guys, I will not pull any punches with you. The wilderness will chew you up and spit you out if you let it. And so sometimes when you are deep in the backside of the wilderness with no idea who you are or where you're supposed to go, or even if you have any place that you can go, be obedient to God's call, even before you know how it's going to go. Because God meets Moses on the backside of the desert. And he says, Moses, I will be with you. And this will be the sign that I'm the one who's sending you. Go get my people. And when it's done, I'll meet you back here on this mountain. The wilderness has this amazing ability to blur the lines of our identity. And when it does, when it calls into question who you are, calls into question your identity, let God's actions bring His identity into focus. Because His identity matters far more for your circumstances than yours ever will. Let me pray for us.